Welcome to Chapter 45 of the Kinsmen Die Podcast, home of fantasy fiction based on Norse mythology that's written and read by me, Matt Bishop. In this podcast, I read my first novel, Kinsmen Die, one chapter at a time. And with each episode, when it makes sense, I provide some commentary about the source materials I've referenced in the text. This week we're with Loki, as he continues his conversation with the Skrymir, the High Chief of the Jotun. In the previous Loki chapter, episode 42, we learned that Loki's nefarious plot is to murder Baldr, the son of Odin. Also recall that Baldr is having weird dreams in which he becomes corpse-like at night, and it's only the rising sun that restores him. The book opened with that event. Also, Frigg is having some visions that suggest Baldr may actually die. And again, Baldr's death is impossible thanks to magic Frigg and Odin used when he was born, and also thanks to their continued sacrifice. Every winter they only eat half of their Yggdrasil fruit. They put the other halves in a bag, and we have not yet seen what they do with them. Loki had planned to murder Baldr on midwinter. The Jotun had also planned to attack Gladsheim on midwinter. These are coordinated strikes, so to speak. But now the Skrymir said they're not going to attack. But they still want Loki to go ahead with his plan. And that is where we rejoin them. So let's get to it. Chapter 45, Loki. "You're serious?" Loki asked, attempting to kill Baldr while Ygg was present. Without a distraction, the Skrymir was mad. Even if he succeeded, he'd be dead moments afterward. He was prepared to sacrifice himself, but not until his children were free. But the Skrymir's expression remained steady, implacable, and oddly familiar. "You are serious?" "Yes, Loki, I am," the Skrymir replied evenly. "Our problem is timing. We're not ready. We need another month before we can get all the warbands positioned and supplied. And despite the problems created by Amma's attack, we believe that if you go ahead anyway, your plan will help buy us that time." Loki couldn't stop shaking his head. A month? He wanted to stand up, to pace, to throw his hands up. He couldn't wait. It had to be this midwinter. He'd already set his plan into motion. Ygg would soon discover what Loki had done, and then cover that chink in Baldr's armor. Unlikely though it was, Ygg might even puzzle out who was behind it all. "We agreed on the first night of midwinter. This midwinter, 7 nights from now. The whole idea was to strike at the same time." The Skrymir spread his hands. "We're not attacking in 7 nights, Loki. If we did, our own plan would fail. The blow we strike, and I do mean we, must end the war even as it begins." Was he hearing this? It was bad enough that Ygg had to come back. And now, after he'd planned for dozens of winters, after he'd passed up several opportunities, the Jotun now asked him to risk all of it. He laughed. "We? This is not what we agreed, Skrymir. It jeopardizes my goals to further yours." The Skrymir raised a hand. "Listen for a moment. We don't have the supplies in place to maintain any advantage created by a surprise attack. You saw the number of wakened Jotun out there. There are another 9 strongholds just like this one. My predecessors planned for this time by submerging supplies in the lakes alongside the sleepers. They say they're preserving some of those supplies failed." "And you didn't plan for that?" "Of course we did, but we lost more than expected, along with many fine Jotun. And the sons of Muspel were supposed to funnel more weapons and armor, food and clothing, to us. Ygg's return and his scrutiny of the Einherjar stopped all that. If we attack at midwinter, they'll roll us right back to the breach, and then the Thunderer will come knocking." "He'll do that anyway," Loki said. "If there's any delay after Baldr's death, then..." "Then what? Would the plan still work?" Originally, it had been about his brutal, impossible strike, followed by an all-out Jotun assault, which would cripple the Aesir and let him safely escape in the confusion. If there was a delay between his strike and the Jotun attack, what would happen? He'd always intended Baldr's murder to be a way to make Ygg feel the pain of loss as deeply, as completely as he and Angrboda had felt the loss of their own children. Would giving Baldr's murder time to sink in be a bad thing? It would mean more time for Ygg's grief to build, and his rage. And then just as they sent Baldr's corpse off to the Gjoll's shores, the Jotun army would attack. And maybe during that confusion he could attempt the second part of his plan, freeing his children. Much less ideal than doing as he'd originally planned, but that was no longer an option. It could work, assuming he escaped after he killed Baldr. And while the Aesir would certainly be distracted, they'd also have time to pick apart how it happened. The Skrymir said the Jotun would not attack, so on midwinter he'd only have his own wits to rely on. He'd always extracted himself from whatever trouble he'd gotten himself into. This was no different, aside from the stakes being literally everything. Did he have a choice? He did, but delay was the coward's path. He was many things, but not that. Never that. And even without the Jotun attack, he would never have as good a chance as now. Seeming to have followed his racing thoughts, the Skrymir said, "I told Vafthrûdnir you'd see advantage in changing the plan." "Potential advantage," he said. "Assuming I succeed and their reaction is as we hope, you don't have a month. Maybe a fortnight at best. Vidar will have backtracked that idiot's warband long before midwinter, at which point Ygg will send Thor. A few nights later, Jotunheim will be smoking rubble. Then the Einherjar and the Aesir army will sweep in to kill everyone else. You're better off attacking during Baldr's funeral." The Skrymir shook his head. "That's all likely, eventually, and I'll consider your proposal. But we have planned for it all, Loki. We're counting on it." "You're all right with letting Vidar find the doorway?" "No, but I also couldn't stop Amma's attack. Too many of the tribal chiefs supported it. Now they'll understand why I opposed it, which makes me look better." The Skrymir sat back. "Besides, Vafthrûdnir is with Helveg now. With his help, they should be able to kill Vidar, should he set foot in Utgard." Loki ignored the twisting of his guts. That put Vali and Narfi in the Bearsark's path. If the Norns had cut an early death for his sons, well, so be it. But he would have liked them to experience more of life before rejoining the Ginnungagap. When, Skrymir, not if, Vidar will find the doorway, he will step through it. He's every bit as curious as his father, and he has more to prove. "I know your sons are with Helveg, Loki. You asked for them to be placed with the best warband, and the best is most often used for the toughest tasks." He gave a quick grin. "I know that. They knew the risks and what they're fighting for, just as those thousands you showed me know." Loki stared down at his hands, at his spread fingers. They and he could be anything he wanted. Too often he let himself become a tool, a weapon wielded by another's hands. Not this time, nor ever again. He would pursue this course no matter what doom the Norns had cut for him. He was not a coward. "If I fall, Sigyn knows where I've hidden." The Skrymir stood and, again, offered his hand. "I give you my word, Loki. The Vafthrûdnir, Beli, and I will do everything in our power to free your children and shelter Sigyn, Vali, and Narfi from the wrath of our enemies." Loki stood and, again, took the Skrymir's hand. "It is fitting that I strike the first blow against the Aesir, and that I steal from them their favorite son." Well, folks, that was Chapter 45 of Kinsmen Die. I hope you enjoyed it. In this chapter, we learn that the reason Loki wants to escape after killing Baldr is to save his 3 children, the ones he had with his first wife, Angerboda. Loki agreed to go ahead with his plan because all the pieces were already in motion, and he thinks that he'll still be able to get away with it, even if the Jotun don't attack on midwinter. Loki's 3 children are Fenrir the wolf, who is chained on a distant island across the sea, Hel, who has not really been mentioned yet. She is prominent in my second book. Last is Jorm, or as most know him, Jormungandr, the world serpent. I'm not going into their stories as told in the myths because some of it comes up in later chapters. I will mention that we've seen one-handed Tyr. It was Fenrir who bit off his hand, and we saw him at the Council of the Aesir. Next week, we're back with Odin, Until then, if you have the time and inclination, please rate or review the podcast. That helps boost the show's visibility, as does sharing it. And if you're so inclined, shoot me an email at mattbishopwrites@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. As always, I'm going to read from both the Bellows and Larrington translations of the Havamal, Sayings of the High One. Bellows, verse 45. If another thou hast whom thou hardly wilt trust, yet good from him wouldst get, thou shalt speak him fair, but falsely think, and fraud with falsehood requite. Larrington, verse 45. If you've another whom you don't trust, but from whom you want nothing but good, speak fairly to him, but think falsely and repay treachery with a lie. Thanks for listening.